the computer. Okay, let me briefly introduce you. My introductions are notoriously very brief. So Ewa Domanska is joining us live from Poland. Thank you for doing this. She's professor of human sciences at the Faculty of History at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poland. But for 20 years, she has been a visiting professor in the Anthropology Department, Archaeology Center of DLCL at Stanford University. Now, DLCL, you have to help me. It's a literature something, but I don't remember what it stands for.
It's the Division of Literature, Cultures, and Languages.
Okay. She studied in the Netherlands, then she came to UC Berkeley, then UC Santa Cruz, and Cornell University, and finally a fellow at Stanford University. Okay, without further ado, I'll let you do your talk. You can you can share the screen, and I will stop my video to make sure that you have maximum bandwidth, so we minimize the chances of technical glitches. Okay, so okay, you see me. If you see me, it means that something's wrong. Otherwise, I stop my video. Okay.
Okay, I still see you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Piero, for inviting me in this difficult times. As Piero said, I am in Poland. I'm supposed to teach a course for Stanford spring term, but I am waiting for development of war in Ukraine. And if there is some direct danger and the war spreads, of course, I can't come. So I'm glad that I can present the conclusions of my research that I was doing last years, but I also had to update the conclusions because the context changed so radically that I think it has to be put in a completely new context in the war in our very close neighborhood. So I will share the screen right now. So give me a moment. So I would like to talk today about the prefigurative art. I will explain the term in a moment, but how I update the title is this the part of the title that has in the time of catastrophe. I'm sure that you noticed that during last years, there was this growing awareness of crisis, permanent crisis and new dangers related to social issues, migrations, terrorism, but also ecological crisis, the loss of biodiversity, and so on, so forth. The situation for my research, for example, changed completely on February 24th, when the war in Ukraine begins. Since I studied the environmental humanities, I was interested in the criticism of anthropocentrism and Eurocentrism. And as you might imagine, this context changed my thinking on these issues completely. This is not only that this kind of popular culture images, movies, and so on, were bombarding us with the images of disasters, but we have a real disaster right now, quite real, and we are talking about many different. Sorry for changing the screen so quickly, but I lost one slide. So we are talking about many different catastrophes in case of Ukraine. So we are talking about environmental catastrophe, humanitarian catastrophe, the possible nuclear catastrophe, global growth catastrophe, food catastrophe. It's like a domino effect. But a couple of years ago, we were talking about this vision of the future that was created by scholars like Alan Weissman or Jan Zalasiewicz, who were talking about very distant future and how we can actually imagine the future already right now. So what was interesting for me, sorry for shifting this. What was interesting for me that we were already for many years living in a kind of anticipatory mode of being. And as Mark Curry, a literary scholar, was saying, this is a typical human condition in a current moment. Of course, he meant it 10 years ago. So he said in a very interesting way that we live in a future anterior tense, where the present is experienced in anticipation of the story we will tell later, envisaging the present as past. So, as you can imagine, in the current situation of the crisis and the situation of Ukraine, I was asking myself how this prediction, how this kind of statement is changing, and how my own research, my own thinking about the environmental crisis, about problems with anthropocentric paradigm change with that. For example, one of the problems that I already discovered several years ago was that the transdisciplinary security studies could offer us a different frame of research to talk about issues discussed within frameworks of many different disciplines in the humanities and social sciences. So recently I was revisiting this idea, and of course I don't need to remind you that the security studies right now are not only about military security, which in fact seems particularly important right now in the part of Europe where I live, but it's also about food security, it's about water security, climate security. So the security studies offer really a very interesting interpretative frame to put our research. I was, for example, as a historian, because I studied history, as a historian, I was asking, how can we talk about securitization of history in a present moment? Is it anything like that right now? How can we secure historical studies and how historians might envision or help to build a kind of various scenarios of the future that would make our future, let's say, more secure, at least in theory, of course. So in current situations, the current situation, I think, forces us to recalibrate. And actually, it is very interesting right now in the current situation to see how this military language that was already introduced into humanities and social sciences. We were constantly, for example, talking about mobilization, that we had to mobilize, we had to recalibrate our research. But of course, at that time, it was mainly about ecological issues, climate change, migration. Now is changing. The context, as I said, is changing. So anyway, so the current situation forces us here, at least in Europe, to recalibrate the principles of research, the principles of teaching, and also often the social work connected with it. Mind you that during 2 weeks, 1.7 million refugees from Ukraine crossed the borders. 1.3 million crossed the borders with Poland. So it is really unimaginable unimaginable forced migration that would cause very different problems. So what I am thinking about right now when I'm thinking about my own research and recalibration of its principles, I am thinking about putting this research also in the frame of something that was recently called in a different context, again, emergency humanities. I found this term in a website that announces a virtual symposium organized in Santa Barbara in 2020, Humanities on the Brink. But it seems to be very, very relevant, particularly relevant right now, where the organizers of the conferences are talking about specific issues that the conference should address. So, for example, I particularly like this idea of cultural arcs to preserve and gender beings, relationship, languages, humanities, and heritages. How to learn, how the humanities could learn from disaster sociology, emergency management. What about apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic imaginaries? So anyway, I find this term very relevant for a current situation. What I also find relevant for the humanities at present is the idea of culture of preparedness. This is the term that appeared many years ago in the context of the devastating disaster of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. But again, I feel that as a scholar who is working on a comparative theory of humanities and social sciences, so looking for new approaches and new theories that might somehow give us a proper conceptual frame to make our own research. So this concept of culture of preparedness, I find particularly useful. So my question in this presentation would be, what is the role of the humanities and arts in a culture of preparedness? What is the role of the emergency humanities and arts in a culture of preparedness? So in my own research, I focused before the war already on three concepts that I find particularly stimulating as a kind of also concept that suggest virtues and values that might be cultivated in this emergency humanities, which is anticipation, adaptation, and resilience. And what you see here is a little logo of the team, the intellectual team that I am in, that is called the Resilient Academic Team. And we are working on a project of preventive humanities for already many years with young scholars, PhD, and postdoctoral scholars from Poland. So I could, if you are interested, I could say something more later. But it's very interesting how the team somehow anticipated the catastrophe to come. So it was very interesting for me when we were discussing the logo that we should behave like rats because they are so resilient, but they are also very intelligent. And they have this ability to survive in a very difficult circumstances. So yes, it's also relevant. Okay, so why I'm interested in particularly in art? Because I feel that the art-based research could help us to build this kind of resilient knowledge that we need in the time of emergency humanities and the culture of preparedness. Sorry for my English. I was not sleeping at night, and I also didn't speak in English for some time. but I hope that the PowerPoint presentation helped to deliver the message of this talk. So I feel that the art and art practices, especially art-based research, as a kind of method of doing research, could bring us, could develop, already is doing that actually, some anticipatory potential of knowledge, and can help us to build this kind of resilient individual, resilient culture, resilient communities, which we need so much right now. So now, what I mean by prefigurative art. I understand this art as art practices in a broad sense that somehow pre-shape the future, which means that they might offer some resolution for contemporary crisis. So I also feel that some artists are very successful in creating images of realistic utopias. And I really focus on this concept realistic. I'm not speaking about some futuristic, post-human images, but I'm speaking about the utopias that are possible to build here and now. So they are limited in time and space, but still they are building a kind of hopeful future. And especially right now, I feel that the idea of critical hope, which is so important for Latin American intellectual culture, but also in the feminist discourse right now. This idea of critical hope, it means that if you hope for something, you really must act in order to fulfill this hope. So this critical hope is strategically needed right now. This is something which I feel is also a kind of obligation for intellectuals right now, especially again in this part of Europe that are facing a lot of problems and actually ethical dilemmas. Imagine, for example, the director of the university gives an order to the deans to expel all the Russian scholars that we have. And they are our colleagues, they are our friends. They are guilty only of being Russians, right? So there is a lot of ethical dilemmas, how we can behave in this situation, right? How these people who are actually innocent are being punished by being Russians. So that's critical. It's critical. We are really tested. Our ethical stand is really tested in many different fronts. So I borrowed this idea of prefiguration from the anthropologist Margaret Mead, who in her book Culture and Commitment was talking about prefigurative culture, which she felt is very different from the past culture, since we are in the situation right now that actually the older generation is learning from young generation, which causes a lot of problems. For example, the crisis of authority of senior members of society. Here, in this graph, you will see these different cultures that Margaret Mead was indicating, and under the prefigurative culture, you feel again a very relevant remarks. Now that the future that we were anticipating, this catastrophic future, this disastrous future, is already now, right? So there are very rapid changes. That the past and present becomes a kind of distance. So anyway, what is also interesting that the war is not futuristic. It's a brutal, vulgar non-post-human war. It's just something that we experienced during the Second World War. There is no improvement whatsoever, right? From let's say, conducting the war point of view. Only technology improved, and we used. I mean, the aggressor, the sites use, for example, drones. So this is about critical hope, and I am also interested in this values, which is very interesting. I have to say, maybe some graduate students are listening us right now. So there is this kind of tendency in the humanities and social sciences to talk about intellectual virtues and social values as methods of our research. So we talk not only about the hope as a method, but also about sincerity as method, friendship as method, care as method, utopia as method, imagination as method. And I see a very interesting potential for really developing this idea. You can see a couple of a few bibliographical references. I was also teaching a course for Stanford in 2017. So if you want to see a full syllabus of this course, you just Google Domanska courses, and the title was New Methodologies in the Humanities and Social Sciences. I really recommend you to take a look. Maybe you will find references that you would need for your own research. So now about art. What is important in this idea of prefigurative art is that, as T.J. Mitchell in his famous book "What the Pictures Want" said, that there are some images in our culture which are somehow going before us. They are leading us to some sometimes unknown future. So I was asking myself in the current situation, what are these images which are reshaping the future? Can we find some images that are positively reshaping the future? And of course, I will talk about it in a moment. But still, when I look at these images that we are bombarded right now, I'm speaking about the war in Ukraine, there are, of course, negativity of violence, brutal violence, but there are also a lot of images of human solidarity and courage and help, and many different features that are testing our humanity. And I think that we might also focus on these images and treat them as reshaping the future, reshaping from the point of view of building knowledge that might help us to live together in conflicts in the future, because even if the war ends, we are going to have a lot of problems caused by the effects of this war for many years. So I also focus on post-secularism and apotropaic texts. I learned that after the terrorist attack on World Trade Center, there were a lot of novels, testimonies published, and some scholars said that they were functioning in a society as apotropaic texts. Some texts, but also I could say the same about images or even material artifacts that supposed to somehow protect us from bad things to happen. So there is a kind of textual magic involved here, but I think that this defensive practices that create a critical hope in society are very important. But of course, as I said, it's not only about texts. It's also about music. It's also about artifacts. It's about images. So I'm just saying, I'm not saying that this is something new. In contrary, we know about it for centuries how it works. But I think that we might come back to this idea and inspect it in our research. I think I will skip this this part because the time is running. I just want to mention and really recommend this very good book by Miranda Fricker, Epistemic Injustice. But what I would like to take from this book as a part of this project of prefigurative art is the idea that Miranda Fricker wants to go beyond Marx and Foucault, and she is using analytical philosophy to talk about testimonial injustice. So, how, for example, your gender or your race really is important when we are talking about what testimony is more valuable than other. But what I like about Fricker, she's also referring to virtue epistemology. So what is important, again, I am contextualizing it all the time to what is going on in East Central Europe right now. We need this strong subject. You know, all that is so ironic that postmodernism was fighting all the time with essentialism and strong subject. But in the time of crisis right now, we need this reconceptualization of the strong subject and essentialism. Of course, we learn something from postmodernism, so I'm not talking about this hardcore essentialism, but I think that this is, again, that idea that is worth to rethink. Part of this rethinking, in my case, is this idea that I took from Miranda Fricker, virtue epistemology, which means that if you want to create good knowledge, truthful knowledge, sincere knowledge, the knowledge that we need for emergency humanities, you have to be a virtuous subject yourself. So, for example, if you are not sincere, you are not going to create a sincere knowledge. Of course, it's not so easy as I say here, but this is just an example from what kind of traditional thinking we might borrow ideas in order to create this knowledge prefigurative art in a time of emergency. And now, I will finish. This is an example. I would like to present the example that I have from Ariella Azulay, Israeli artist, but also intellectual and photographer, and her project is called Potential History. And she was investigating the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and what she did, she collected a kind of citizen archive looking for photographs that also show the potential, the cooperation between the Israeli Palestinians before the conflict. And she argues that the potential history by these images, because she was traveling with this exhibit, with this project all over the world, that showing these images that shows the potential collaboration and cooperation, marriages between Israeli Palestinian citizens. You know, this is to show how this unrealized potential. It unrealized because these businesses, these marriages could not be fully developed because of the conflict. But it shows unrealized potential. And the question is how we can mobilize this unrealized potential for building a better scenario of the future. So I feel again that this idea of potential history might be interesting as a kind of a specific example of prefigurative art, the art that reshaped the future more in a more optimistic colors. So how to create this knowledge right now, how the current situation reshapes our research here in East Central Europe. You know, many projects just fail because they're completely irrelevant for the current situation. So this would be my contribution, and I'm sorry to be so up to date with the situation, but I feel that this is also my obligation to support my colleagues and friends from Ukraine and to show that we are in Poland really working in academia, and not only in a very direct way, helping personally, but also building knowledge that might somehow support and help to build a better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. I was frantically taking notes. There's a lot to process here. So that and I'm also trying to relate it to other things that you have written. You have written a lot of very interesting articles in the past. So now I don't know where to start the questions. Maybe let's start from a higher level. So one topic I would like to briefly discuss is utopia, but also, before I forget, you've done work on a multi-species historiography, right? And I found that very fascinating. So before we go back to the real world that we live in right now, can you tell us something about this idea of the multi-species historiography that I found really intriguing?
Well, you know, this is the topic that actually didn't lose its relevancy, but I don't want to contextualize it again. I will just answer your question. You know, as a historian, I am fully aware that history is usually defined as the science of human beings in time, right? So all this classical definition of history telling us that the main point of interest for historians is the human being and human affairs. With the recent interest in animal studies, plant studies, of course, the Anthropocene, the historians are really challenged because the anthropocentric paradigm is being so highly criticized. So what I'm interested in when I'm talking about multi-species history, so history which is examining, researching not only human beings, human communities as agents of history, but also animal, plants, as well as rivers, islands, and volcanoes as agents. How it challenged history as such, right? It also has to do with the language we are using, because imagine we are also talking about biocommunication. We already had studies where the animals, especially chimpanzees, who know the sign language, can communicate some information related to their past. So how the historians could react on the idea that actually human being is losing epistemic authority to produce knowledge of the past? What the animals could also communicate, they could be also sources of knowledge, could produce testimonies, right? This is really the beginning. But also this is fascinating how, thanks to animal studies, plant studies, history somehow is forced to open itself again to natural sciences. and to disciplines like zoology, ethology, geography, botany, and so on and so forth. What is even more interesting that in this process of merging humanities and natural sciences, a big issue become including in studies, right? And indigenous studies becoming very big when we are talking about the state of emergency, especially ecological disaster, the loss of biodiversity, climate change, and so on and so forth. Multi-species history for me is a kind of laboratory where the whole discipline of history is challenged with all these major bases like anthropocentrism, historicism, teleological thinking, the idea of progress. All history, I think, which as a kind of very specific approach to the past, which developed within the Judeo-Christian, Greco-Judeo-Christian tradition, is somehow, as I said, challenged. And I'm afraid that we are witnessing the end of this institutionalized history that developed in 19th century in Germany. I'm not saying that this is the end of history. I'm just saying that this is just a very, the idea of history as we know it, that emerged in Europe, is going through a very, very basic transfigurations, I would say. I don't like the idea of ending and so on and so forth, but it's definitely changing.
Sure, I'll let you ask the question live. I think I saw how all questions if you have more than one. But let me finish my question, otherwise I lose them. The other high level topic I wanted to discuss with you. I have your opinion. You mentioned at one point Ruth Levita's book on utopia. And the original title of your talk had micro-utopia in the title. And so it's, even before the current crisis, I think the last century we have seen this tension between utopia and dystopia. Not that they are different, but the same phenomenon can be viewed as utopia and dystopia. And throughout the last century, you had utopias like the hippie communes and other communal experiments. You had utopian architecture, of course, lots of books. And on the other hand, we had the trend that the governments and big tech encroaching on our privacy. So the very same phenomenon is almost always viewed as both utopia and dystopia. Big artificial intelligence is going to make us immortal, yes, but is also going to control us and we become slave of robots. Communism itself, right, was born as utopia, and it gave us Stalin, Mao, and the dude in North Korea, I don't remember his name, and so on. So it sounds like utopia and dystopia are two faces of the same thing. What's your take on this?
Well, that's why I am not talking about any universal utopias and dystopias, right? I'm interested how you can actually create utopia in a particular here and now, right? Of course, I could say that from the general point of view, every utopia might be a dystopia, but I'm not thinking about saving the world. I'm rather thinking about, how concrete social practices might create a certain model, how the society might look like on a very local scale and temporary scale. So I'm not speaking about, decades. I'm not speaking about countries. I'm speaking about small communities. So how can people arrange themselves? And of course, we see examples like that if you are interested in ecology, you go to Norway and you will see how certain communities are dealing with these issues, right? You can really see how it works on very small scale, because you go to somewhere else and it would not work, right? So that's why I'm speaking about micro utopia, temporary, local. But of course, I do agree with you that any utopia might turn into dystopia, right? Any positive action might be positive for certain group of people and might be completely disastrous for others.
Yeah. So in a sense, my problem is that maybe we live in the age of pessimism, meaning in the past, utopia was a way to foster positive thinking about the future. And now the moment you have utopia, you have dystopia. You also have the dystopian approach to the utopian. So it kills any momentum towards positive thinking about the future. Am I being too negative?
No, but that's exactly what the prefigurative art is about, what potential history and the project by Ariela Azoulay is about, right? That you have a disaster, you have the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but you look for photographs that show cooperation, right? Cohabitation, peaceful cohabitation. And you really force it somehow. You advocate for it, you show it, you say that different world is possible, right? On a local scale. So you give people hope that the situation might be different. So that's exactly, I am very much into affirmative thinking. The same like Rosi Braidotti. I don't know if you read her book, but she said that we can't afford pessimism because the situation is too dangerous to be pessimistic, right? Pessimism might lead to a kind of losing your agentive power, right? So you rather have to reinforce the subject and not disarm the subject. So, for example, all these images of help that we have all over right now to Ukrainian refugees are really building the sense of community solidarity, at least here and now, because we are absolutely aware that in a couple of months it might be completely different. Right, but at least here and now, when you bombard society with these images of necessity of help and the acts of help and solidarity, it really creates a kind of imaginarium, social imaginary that is really building the resilience, right, and supporting people in Ukraine. So it works, but again, it works here and now. It might be different in a couple of weeks or a couple of months when situation changed.
I want to get to what artists can do, but first let me, Kurt, you feel like asking the question directly so we don't have to read it?
Yeah, sure, I'll try. So you've talked about some really big problems and fascinating presentation. I'm wondering, engineers and technology are the source of some of those problems, climate, for example, exaggerations to make the climate change, which is a natural process, worse. How do you see humanists interacting with technologists, with scientists and engineers to talk about what's possible and what's less possible to actually solve problems? And if you could put this in an academic context, how do we train students to be thinking on both sides of their brain, both the humanist perspective as well as the physical science perspective?
Thank you very much for this question. It's important. And I actually mentioned one aspect of it, that, for example, what I see as a scholar working on this comparative theory of the humanities and social sciences, that there is this call from all over for mobilization of scholars from humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences. So there is the absolute awareness that in order to solve the problems of contemporary world, we have to join forces, right? We have to join forces. So, for example, I'm working on many different things, but my empirical knowledge is about political exhumations, dead body studies. So I can't really solve certain research problems if I do not go to forensic sciences, if I do not study biology, chemistry. I'm speaking about, for example, environmental history of the mass graves. I'm not going to handle this problem if I am staying in humanities only, because humanities, the approach offered by humanities would reduce my interpretation. Of course, I could say the same for scholars from natural sciences, that if they stay only within their own fields, it would also narrow the interpretation of the particular phenomena. So when you are asking me about how we can educate students, I think that if a student, especially a graduate student, wants to work on a subject that requires both sides, both cultures, right? As we could say that after this famous science wars, but I don't want to use the term war. So if we want to educate really progressive scholars, they have to study both sciences. For example, anthropology and chemistry, or history and biology. I have a graduate student who is working on water heritage. I say, okay, history is on one side, but hydrology is on the other. You have to have a knowledge of both. So I think that offering programs for students who are interested in this complementary approach. That's the term I really like to use. Complementary research, complementary approach. So the humanities and natural sciences would complement and supplement each other when dealing with particular issues, could also help. Of course, it's not for everyone. It's just for students who are interested in subject research that requires this both fields together. But I'm not saying for all of them. But this is one of the track that I think it would be profitable for the future. And of course, again, telling students, making them aware, showing concrete examples how this complementary approach is very useful, with not only concluding the effects of research, but also showing concrete resolutions for problems that we are dealing with. So this knowledge should be quite practical, should have this social relevance, right? And especially with technology, I know that there is a great interest in artificial intelligence, in transhumanism, and so on and so forth. And of course, this is also part of our future. Again, we need a very strong ethical stand. And actually, when talking about criticism of anthropocentrism and humanism, we have to be careful with that. Right? And my personal involvement in this research is always guided by the question, should I be critical about humanism or should I support it, right? Should I be critical about anthropocentrism or should I support it? And of course, it depends in what context and in what field of research, because there are many different layers of these problems. But anyway, I don't know if I satisfied you, but this would be the answer.
I certainly agree that cross-training of individuals could possibly lead to a better educated student. My sort of follow-up question is, what mechanisms do you know of that exist for funding research in these cross-disciplinary areas? It's hard enough to get funding in one discipline. To get it between disciplines is probably going to be much harder.
Yes, I completely agree. I also agree with, for example, issue of job market, right? I remember that when I was advocating this kind of transdisciplinary approach, the advisors of the thesis would say, but you have to take into consideration that this the student would go onto a job market, and if he or she has no concrete, discipline assigned, it would be very difficult for him or her to find a job. So I understand the problem caused by this institutional problems. But I also think that it will change, right? I mean, it's changing. It has to somehow be refigured is in case of funding. I don't know how it is in the United States, but I know that, for example, foundations like Mellon Foundation are offering grants that support, or European Council offer grants that support this kind of transdisciplinary research. I think it's not so bad. I would say it's worse with getting a job if you are, if you are combining too many fields.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so now let me now I'll go a little bit into a different topic. But since you guys started talking about the role of the humanities, I want to see if my thought about the humanities is somehow is compatible with your view. So humanities are very useful to study the past. I found the humanities spend most of their time studying the past, and there's very important lessons to be learned there. I mean, behind me, probably, this is all the classics of philosophy. And then very often they talk about the present, but with a little delay. And that's why sometimes you see engineers and scientists rolling their eyes when they listen to a philosopher or even to an artist, because the philosopher and the artist is 5 or 8 years behind, actually. AI becomes very popular in the arts 2017-18, but it's already, that's technology invented 2012. And the same with philosophers, who a few years later start talking about virtual reality, now the metaverse, which actually has been around for, 20 years almost, and so on. And the humanities don't really spend a lot of time really being future-oriented, right? You speak about future-oriented humanities. So if I have so that's my view, and you can tell me if I'm completely wrong. And then my question for you, if you had a future-oriented humanities lab, Stanford creates a whole lab devoted for that, what would it look like?
Well, I think that with the discussion of the Anthropocene that dominated humanities and social sciences for the last, 20 years already, is very future-oriented, right? The Anthropocene is now, but everything that we are talking about is what is going to be if we do not take action, right? So this is a kind of consciousness raising. I'm speaking about the discourse of Anthropocene, which is very future-oriented, right? How we should react, because if we don't react, something is going to happen. It already is happening, right? So I think that the humanities, of course, not whole humanities, because I am very much interested in this kind of avant-garde tendencies, which are somehow dominating the hottest debate, right, that are going on. I'm not speaking about this majority, which is doing their own stuff and not really care about this new fashionable ideas. But these discussions, which, for example, you mentioned multi-species history, or the discussion about the Anthropocene, or the discussions about the climate change and environmental humanities, bioart. You said that art is also about the past. It is about the past, but there are many tendencies in contemporary art, like art and science and bioart, which actually cooperate very, very closely with molecular biologists, with engineers, and so on and so forth, to build art, which is actually technology, right? The same with architects. So, well, I would say that we are going through a major paradigm shift right now. So it's going to change many things. I don't know how the current political situation would affect it, but what I observed since 2001, which is a symbolic date for the end of postmodernism, is a mass of many different terms that mark the paradigm change. By what I mean is this criticism, which is this, being future-oriented, not presentist, but future-oriented, means being critical to anthropocentrism, means being critical to Eurocentrism, to the idea of progress. Also going beyond this idea of secularism, the post-secular turn is actually a very, very interesting phenomena, right? How we can again connect spirituality and religion, and how we can involve this theology into academic discourse. And as I said, the indigenous turn, where indigenous knowledge and indigenous ways of knowing in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Latin America, is really very powerfully entering the academic discourse, is becoming part of it, right? So it will change our also idea of science, because the idea of science, how we define science, is also changing, is changing all the time. So we are indeed living in a very interesting time to observe this transformations.
You mentioned paradigm shifts. See, you said critical, to be critical of something, but that's not necessarily a paradigm shift. I guess to me, future-oriented humanities should also be about a different way of thinking. Just to quote Einstein, what did he say? We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used them when we created them, right? And so that's a real challenge. And by the way, in my opinion, crises like Ukraine fit. I mean, both sides have to use a different kind of thinking if we want to avoid these things. So to me, that's the paradigm shift, where where you introduce a new kind of thinking, not just being critical about the current thinking. That's my opinion.
I completely agree. So maybe I didn't express it myself properly. What I am saying is this, new worldview, right? New worldview, which is going beyond anthropocentrism, beyond Eurocentrism, beyond secularism. So I do understand that the paradigm shift is about major change in a worldview. It's like a conversion, right? I know that, right? But I'm speaking about critical from the point of view of not being critical in the discursive term, but also by making academia very engaged in social and political affairs, right? We are talking all the time about engaged humanities, emancipatory humanities, and so on and so forth. So it's not only about being critical, but it's also about making concrete changes in our, environment. I totally agree with you that this is not about criticizing things only.
Yeah, and personally, I think artists can be very very productive in creating new ways of thinking, although in their own irrational way. But that could be an important force in society. Okay, now that we used the 1 hour, I think, of your time, I have to ask you a question about your book Necros. I don't know if it is published in English. I saw you wrote a book, An Introduction to the Ontology of the Dead Body. I'm just curious, what is it about?
Well, I have to say that the book is already fully translated. The English title is Necros, An Ontology of Human Remains. So, yes, the book is about how death might be considered as a way of life from physical and chemical point of view. What I mean by that is that, of course, in our humanistic culture, we don't like to look into the grave, right? We usually talk about memories, we look about sepulchral culture, and so on and so far. But we are not talking about the remains in such a way that forensic anthropologists, archaeologists, or forensic scientists are talking about it. So I opened the grave and looked into it, and was thinking how our, for example, rituals of dealing with the human remains in our society are changing right now. So I'm interested in, for example, natural decomposition and biourns and cryonics and turning human ashes into synthetic diamonds, which is called life gem. So how the body is transforming, for example, how the human ash is transforming into a synthetic diamond. This is actually, from philosophical point of view, a phenomenal subject of research. Since the idea of ash to ash and, you turn into ash and you spread is not working here, because the diamond is beyond the idea of salvation. It's uncorruptible. You can't destroy it. So it would also survive the atomic disaster. So, all philosophical issues are here. Symbolically, what diamond means in society from social, sociological point of view, but what it means to have a diamond made of ashes of your the member of your family. I was conducting interviews with the families who did this. Who transformed the human ash into a diamond in California. And I was talking to one lady, a mother of a son who was killed in Santa Cruz, and she said that she went to the bank and take some extra money because she wanted her son to be transformed into a diamond, and after she was considering to have earrings or belly rings. So these people have very concrete ideas why they want to do it. It's not pathology of some funeral jewelry or something like that. But of course, we also have to know the history of that. This is nothing unusual. This is a kind of relic related to the idea of reliquary that we know for ages, and it was somehow related to the higher classes. But right now, you have to have a relic of your beloved, real presence in a form of diamond that you might have with you at home, and it comforts people during the morning and after. I have to say that this was a very impressive conversations that also changed my view on many different things. Yeah, so Necros is about different non-human condition, non-human body condition. My question is, when we stop to recognize human being in human remains, when it happens, right? Yes, so I hope that the book will be published. I would very much the book to be published by Stanford University Press. Let's see if they would be interested.
Okay. Okay, I think we have material for 10 more laser talks with you. Eva, thank you very much. I think you are one of the most original thinkers I've met in my life.
Piero, thank you so much. And let's hope that I will come to Stanford. And if I come to Stanford in March, I would very much to meet you in person, and maybe we can continue our conversation. I really appreciate your invitation. I hope that you are not disappointed.
Not disappointed at all. Thank you very much, and good evening in Poland.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you very much.